I mix what I like, 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 what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. I Mix What I Like.org for more on this show and more. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to play host. And today we're having a conversation that's, again, long overdue, as most of our conversations are, with two great guests to talk about the relationship of Latin America or the Latino world and hip hop. First joining us is Melissa Castillo-Garsow, who is working on her PhD from Yale in American and African American Studies and is also co-editor of a forthcoming and seminal anthology, Manteca, and correct me on that in just a moment, an anthology of Afro-Latino poetry. But today we are here to discuss her co-edited anthology, La Verdad, an international dialogue on Hip Hop Latinidades, with her co-editor, Dr. Jason Nichols of the African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland. And he is also the editor-in-chief of the Words, Beats, and Life Global Journal of Hip Hop Culture. Welcome again to the both of you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared.
Thanks for having us.
So I wanted to start with where you both start with in La Verdad, with the question of defining or undefining Latinidades. So please, first, Melissa, if you would correct me on the pronunciation of the title of that other anthology you're coming out with, and then
Right, Manteca.
Manteca, thank you. And then let's move on to this question of what it means to define, or as you say, undefine Latinidades.
Well, I mean, honestly, it just started with like a conversation between Jason and me and us like disagreeing on basically everything when we were trying to like define Latino hip hop. And so based on that, we just, for as many things as you could, like, it was like, you can say things about thematics, about language, about origins, about, I don't know, and for everything, there's not just exceptions, but there's a lot of exceptions. There's indigenous people in Guatemala, in Peru, in Mexico, rapping indigenous languages that nothing to do with Spanish, right? And there's, people that are where the thematics are really about indigenous and mestizo cultures, and others where it's really about the African diaspora. And that's, their background. There are immigrants to the US who are also talking about their experiences as maybe Afro-Latinos, but in the United States, and that's very different from, favelas in Brazil. So we just realized, I think if anything, that we need to give space to all these different hip-hop voices that, were in Latin America or Latin American descended.
Well, now, Jason, I want you to answer that too, but, because I want also to add in that over the last maybe year or so, for me in particular, and I think for maybe many others, the Latinx identifier has come into play as well. But if you would add your thoughts on this undefining or defining what it means to be Latina or Latino, or in the.
I mean, that was one of the reasons why it's an international dialogue, is because, it's such a broad, definition. This is why we included places like she mentioned Spanish. And, when you talk about Latinidades, you have to also have the conversation about places like Haiti, places like Suriname, so places, of course, Brazil. So there are a lot of things, we make this very Spanish centric. And I always tell the story about in my class, and I'm pretty sure you and I have had this conversation, where I referred to one of my students as Latino, and he was, not offended, but he was very quick to correct me. He was of the Mapuche people in Chile. And he was like, I don't define myself as Latino, I'm Mapuche, and calling myself Latino would be admitting defeat to the Spanish. So, he identified with his indigenous culture. So we really wanted this to be a broad conversation and to include as many places and many people as we could into this discussion.
And honestly, we could have included more. We got submissions from way more places. It just ended up being like a selection of quality, to be honest. But we got hundreds of submissions from every part of Latin America. Like, it was pretty amazing, to be honest. Like,
Be ready for the next volume, I guess.
Well, I mean, I can only imagine, because usually, as Jason, you were telling that story, usually in my limited experience, it's sort of the other version, which is I assume someone is black, and then they tell me, no, I'm not black, I'm Latino, or I'm from some other part of the world. And I'm like, whoa, I didn't, and it's not like you said, it sometimes comes with offense, but it's like, I didn't mean to offend you. I just was limited in my own, awareness of the situation. So that, I thought that was an important part of what you all were doing in this book here. And sort of as an extension of that question, I wanted to also ask, why did you think it was important, and why was it, or is this book so seminal in its nature in terms of dealing with the relationship of hip hop and Latin America? A lot of us would have thought that would have been a natural and well understood relationship, but clearly not.
Well, I think that a lot of when we talk about hip hop and people who are Latino or Latinx or people of that part of the world, we usually limit it to Puerto Ricans and Puerto Rico. We talk about the Bronx and that kind of, migration from the island of Puerto Rico to that area. Or we talk mainly about, people in the United States and Chicanos, and it's very West Coast and LA centric. And honestly, when we first started out, I was thinking about different parts of the country. Honestly, I was thinking mainly a domestic book. It was really Melissa's contribution where she said, no, let's make this international. Let's talk about, hip hop is so broad. Like she said, people are rapping in indigenous languages. They're doing all kinds of things in Latin America. And, it would be a disservice if we made it seem like hip hop is limited within our borders.
Melissa, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really exciting thing about what's going on in Latin America is, it's really it really reminds me of, I personally wasn't there, but what people talk about in terms of the Bronx, in terms of it being like a collaborative, multiracial, musical event. Like, these young people in Latin America, they're not rapping to get rich or to get famous. They are hanging out, they're expressing themselves, and a lot of the time, like a lot of the young people in this book, they don't have resources to, create music or express themselves in other ways. And so, that same way that hip hop was so powerful for young people in the Bronx and its like origins, you really see that going on in Latin America, and it's just super exciting and inspiring,
Melissa, let me stay with you for a second, because you also say that there's a passage in your chapter that has really struck me in dealing with this question of Latin America's relationship to what is called the Hip Hop Nation. And I've long time had a problem with the concept of the Hip Hop Nation, primarily because I've never thought people conceptualize that appropriately as a colonial relationship. But you problematize that differently, and I want to just read this and have you respond. You said, here we face a clear conundrum. If, and you're vamping off of Paul Gilroy, if, as Gilroy argues, black music reflects a certain type of national authenticity, then the perception of hip-hop as authentically black American is problematic. It certainly does not reflect hip-hop's history nor its present, but instead is an act of erasure on part of white America to streamline U.S. culture into something racially categorizable. I can't even say the word.
Yeah.
Could you expand on what you're saying there, and again, how this relates to this question of what is Latin America's relationship to hip-hop?
Yeah, hip hop came from the Bronx in a period of time when the Bronx was, lower middle class, where you actually had good schools. It came right after this, or like in the 60s, they had good schools, you had lots of music, you had music programs in schools, and it was racially diverse. You had white people and African American people and Latino people. Like, you talk to people from who grew up in the Bronx in the 60s, they're like, yeah, we all went to school together. This was like in the 60s, and you're like, have complete, residential and racial integration. And then you have the economic downturn and, all the problematics that happen in the Bronx from which hip hop is a response to. But in order to kind of like tell that as a neater story, for some reason, hip hop became MCs and MCs became Black and Black became African American. And as that happened, hip hop started to become very much consumed by white America. I'm not saying other people don't listen to hip hop, but they're the ones who are spending money on it, right? And it was just easier in some ways to create this kind of streamlined, very simple narrative. But if you go back and you undo that narrative to what actually occurred and, how what hip hop actually came out of, then the fact that, Latinos are in hip hop, that, Mexicans do hip hop, that you have hip hop all across Latin America is obvious, it makes sense. Because these people also, the Latin American descendants in the Bronx and all of New York City, it's not like they completely lose connections with Latin America. Like, where do you think the mixtapes got to Mexico City and to Rio de Janeiro and, why they first started doing hip hop in the first place? Because those transnational Latin American connections were always there.
And Jason, I definitely want you to, if you'd like to expand on that, but I also wanted to ask you about one of the themes I picked up in your chapter, and forgive me if my bias took away from your emphasis on what you call here the Black spiritual identities of Tego Calderon and Don Omar. But one of the points that I picked up on that is obviously important to me in terms of my own bias is this relationship of various Latino communities to Black America. And there was something that I was picking up, and I think both of you actually deal with this on some level, but there's something you actually said that there's something in the difference between the way Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, for instance, approach hip hop that has something specific to do with their proximity or distance from Black America. Just go ahead, Jason. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, let me just say, one of the things that I think it's Gay Teresa Johnson says is that there is, of course, with African Americans and Latinos and people from Latin America and people from the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, and if you're talking about the Bronx and Harlem and Queens and even, Philadelphia, other places, you had more spatial proximity. The way, if for example, LA, the way it was redlined, there were, more separation between Latinos who primarily were from Mexico and African Americans. But that doesn't mean, as Gay Teresa Johnson says, sound travels where people don't. So, if you and I were to go to LA and turn on a Chicano oldies station, we would hear Motown. You know what I mean? Like those are Chicano oldies. That's what they listen to. So I don't mean to suggest that there wasn't a cultural exchange between African Americans and say Mexican Americans on the West Coast. There's a huge cultural exchange. Being an East Coast kid growing up, my first exposure to things like lowriders and khaki suits was, Snoop Dogg. But, you come and you find out that was really a cultural exchange with Mexican Americans and African Americans. And even though they weren't necessarily hanging out, they took from one another's culture and built something that was authentically West Coast hip hop. But I do think that the spatial proximity between African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Puerto Ricans, where it's like we live together. In some cases, we're not even distinguishable by the way we look. I think that makes a difference in terms of the culture that you create.
From what I remember of Johnson's work, and again, my memory may not be functioning properly here, but it seems like you paint a more negative picture of that black Chicano exchange than she does, and some of what you talk about here are even you cite the work of Barrios and this whole issue of even Chicanos saying we don't want anything to do with black people. And we don't want anything to do with Latinos who are identified with black people, namely Jennifer Lopez. And I was like, dang, man, I'm trying to be this pan everything. I'm like, damn, we got issues, And Johnson's book, I felt like was a more positive interpretation of that relationship. But if you would say a few more words about that.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, Gay Teresa Johnson, I think is brilliant. But I took Barrios' book because it seemed like it was, it was basically written by some street guys who were talking about things that were on the ground, and they weren't trying to intellectualize it, and they didn't have an agenda of being pan everything. You know what I mean? These were guys who were performing hip hop, in their space on the West Coast, and this is the way they interpreted it. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that that's everybody's experience. I think there is, I know the artists that I met in my artistic life from LA, so a lot of them were Mexican-American, and they showed me tons of love, So that's not to say that there isn't any kind of, close relationships, but I think we also have to talk about the reality of anti-Blackness, of, what white supremacy does to separate different people of color.
Oh man, we were just watching the Latin American Music Awards. What was it, a week or so ago? And I all I noted, I was like, wow. I said Latin America's not black at all, apparently, according to the people on the stage. And yet everybody on stage was performing black, particularly black American cultural performance. So I was like, this is really deep. Anyway, yeah.
No, I watched that exact same thing.
It was like watching telenovelas. It's like, where are the black people at? It's like,
yeah. Oh, well, the black people will show up. They'll be
maids, right.
And the indigenous people too. It's the same thing.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Good point. Good point.
I mean, and that's been like a major criticism of, for example, like Telemundo and Mexican television in general. Yeah. So yeah, it's so funny. People are always like, you don't look Mexican. I'm like, I look like the telenovelas. So
right, yeah.
You watch I don't know. But I think what Jason was saying is a really good point. And I think like there are a lot of like problematics, but exchange works on different levels. Like sometimes people don't get along, they still listen to each other's music and they still vibe off of it. And I mean, so like the young Mexican migrants in New York City that I did a lot of interviewing with, for example, they're like, who do you look up in hip hop? They're like Nas, Biggie, like they know all like the really like great African American rappers. Do they hang out with African Americans a whole lot? No. Is it like a beef? No. For them, somewhat it's a language barrier. They mostly function in Spanish, but it's also like it's really interesting, and like it's like, well, we have different this is our way to express our culture. Mexico, we want to,
It also reminds me of that scene from Do the Right Thing.
Can I talk to you for a second? What? Pino, who's your favorite basketball player?
Magic Johnson.
Who's your favorite movie star?
Eddie Murphy.
Who's your favorite rock star? Prince. You're a Prince fan.
Boss, Bruce.
Prince.
Bruce.
Pino, all you ever talk about is nigga this and nigga that. And all your favorite people are so-called niggas.
It's different. Magic, Eddie, Prince are not niggas. I mean, they're not black. I mean, let me explain myself. They're not really black. I mean, they're black, but they're not really black. They're more than black. It's different.
It's different?
Yeah, to me, it's different.
Pino, deep down inside, I think you wish you were black.
Get the fuck out of here.
Laugh if you want to. Your hair is kinkier than mine.
Listen, so I had to say this, Jason. The only criticism I have is that you let Lil Wayne stand as a sole representative of United States artists on this question of complimenting or denigrating the complexion of black women. And I'm like, how you gonna let Lil Wayne be the sole representative?
Yeah, no, there's a
No, but you were making a good point, though. I do want to say, I think you made a good point in terms of the denigration of darker skinned women, and you were pointing out the positive aspect of some of the Puerto Rican reggaeton artists who show pride in the blackness of their population. So I appreciated that. And I also appreciated the shout out to the Panamanian Black Consciousness movement. Not a lot gets said about any of that.
And they get erased a lot from the history of reggaeton in general.
Right.
People don't talk about it, except for the reggaeton artists themselves. If you listen to what even the big reggaeton artists from Puerto Rico, they always shout out Panama as being like,
right,
the foundation of it.
So look, we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to just let Jason. I'll start with you. If any concluding comments about this anthology or the work in general, or something you would like folks to take away from it as they investigate this work.
Well, I guess I'm going to say something really basic, and that is that we need to realize that hip hop is it's global. Although it's rooted in a Pan-African experience. And one of the things that I did want to say, I wanted to cite and shout out my man Robert Tinajero, who actually does a lot of work on Mexican Americans along the border. And he says, a lot of the people where his work really found its thrust was that he would talk to these kids. They'd be like, I love Tupac, but I don't really like black people, Then they don't, people don't find a whole lot of contradiction in that. America has been listening to black music, black, jazz artists. They love Coltrane. They love Charlie Parker, something that Amiri Baraka always talked about. Oh, you love Bird, but you don't love the communities that Bird came out of, So I think that's the contradiction of white supremacy that we've always had. Other than that, I think the book tries. I mean, it's very, very difficult within, the pages of one book to really show the contributions that people make to hip hop. So it's not just that hip hop spread to Latin America, it's that Latin America is making a contribution to hip hop itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Melissa, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, the book's a dialogue, and I think that's like, it's about hip hop, but it's about so much more. Hip hop is a vehicle for, young people to dialogue across borders, across countries, and they've been doing it for a long time. And honestly, we just try to put a spotlight on some of the dialogues. I mean, it's constant 24/7. They're YouTubing, Facebooking each other, sending tracks across borders. And honestly, I would just encourage anyone who picks up the book to also YouTube some of these artists and listen to them, because they are saying some really interesting things that sometimes you just got to hear it from the source.
Well, I'll certainly say that the links you promised to send me before we got started, I will add to this interview as well. I want to thank you both for joining us for this very important discussion of Hip Hop Latinidades, La Verdad, an international dialogue on Hip Hop Latinidades by Dr. and Doctors soon-to-be, Melissa Castillo-Garsow and Jason Nichols. Thank you both for joining me. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind.
And they can listen to the author, too, if they want. Or the editor. They can certainly look up Way Waters. They can look up Jesus, Haysos, if they want to hear some good music.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.